All right, hello and welcome to this episode where we're going to talk about the fear of violent or hostile or unwanted, aggressive thoughts, so to speak. And these thoughts can lead people to, these fears of, what if I'm evil, and what if I'm a bad person, what if I'm a serial killer, things like that, right? So it's kind of like there's two layers to these fears, right? There's the fear of having the thoughts themselves, and then there's the secondary layers of like what those thoughts mean about you as an individual. And so, these thoughts generally, obviously under the contingent that these aren't thoughts that you want in your mind, right? These are thoughts that are repelling and very, anxiety provoking. That is a good indicator that these thoughts usually fall in that realm of what we call pure OCD, or just OCD in general. Actually, the idea of pure O is just that there's no compulsions, but with these thoughts there are almost always again compulsions or behaviors that the person's engaging in that's really keeping that loop going. And so, some of those behaviors could be things like avoiding, movies that trigger them, or avoiding, situations, avoiding touching knives, avoiding, just things that they think are dangerous, as well as checking and mental compulsions like ruminating, analyzing, and so on. So, when it comes to the fear of these thoughts, it's so important to, realize that, number one, that these thoughts are a normal part of the human experience, right? Unwanted thoughts and thoughts, kind of popping into your mind is a normal occurrence, right? In surveys, most people have these kind of thoughts pop up in their mind. The thing that makes it different for someone who's experiencing OCD or is really stuck in a loop about like a certain topic is that individual is reacting to it, right? Like it's a real danger. And more importantly, engaging in behaviors that are reinforcing the idea that it's dangerous. So let me go ahead and give an example of, someone I worked with one time. So once I was working with this mother, right, young mother, who was having these intrusive thoughts that she might snap and hurt her little baby, right? And obviously these thoughts were extremely distressing to her because she had read some news article that or seen something on the news or something like that of a mom, essentially suffocating her baby to death on purpose. And what we need to remember is that with OCD and anxiety in general, usually the things that we worry about have a hint of reality to them in the sense that, these things are possible, right? Someone worrying about getting in an accident when they're driving is, it's possible to get in an accident, right? What the paradox is that the more you worry about something, the worse and worse it gets, right? You're not going to drive as well when you are worrying about getting in an accident, right? Because, it's just, you're not going to be as attuned. So, and that's the paradox of OCD and anxiety, right? The more and more we worry about it and try to protect our kids or protect the people from violent thoughts, what happens is we actually distance ourselves so much from them that we don't even have a relationship with them, right? Which is actually more damaging in many ways. And that's the real paradox of living in fear, right? Is that essentially by trying to, in many ways, not have something happen and control life, we then, make sometimes even a worst case scenario come true, right? Because when fear is driving you, again, all it does is produce chaos. And so, with that said, when it comes to these fear of unwanted, violent, and intrusive thoughts, right? The thoughts with this mother, one of the first things that we had to do was, really get her to see that these thoughts were ego-dystonic, right? These thoughts weren't something that she really wanted to do. They weren't a reflection of some deep, dark part of herself, right? It was an intrusive thought that popped up. And in this case, it popped up as a result of this thing that she'd read, right? And she didn't want that to happen. And so what happened was that she got really anxious. And when she got really anxious, she then started engaging in these behaviors to try to make sure that didn't happen, like avoiding touching her baby, right? Because it was like, well, I can't touch her because, I might freak out. I might do this. So her husband, the brunt of the childcare and all the stuff fell on his shoulders. And what we need to see in this situation, this is really common, right, with these unwanted thoughts, is that it starts to put strains in different parts of our lives, right? Because, most of the time people don't want to be honest about what they're even dealing with. So then our spouses, our children, our parents start to become the accommodators, right? And the husband thinks he's doing a good thing, right? He's like, okay, well, this is taking stress away. Maybe this will help, right? But what's actually happening is the more we engage in these behaviors, the more it reinforces that idea might actually be real, right? So then when the thought pops up again, same kind of thing, right? The anxiety spikes, we have to engage in more behaviors, and it just gets worse and worse. And what started as, maybe not being around a knife in the kitchen with the baby, then becomes to the point of like, I can't change the baby, or I can't do this, I can't, and it just grows and grows and grows. And the more and more OCD and anxiety grows, the smaller and smaller and smaller our life becomes. And this works like this with any real OCD cycle or fear cycle in general, right? The more and more we become afraid of contamination, and the more and more we try to protect ourselves from not getting contaminated, the smaller and smaller and smaller our life has become. And, 2020 has been a really good example of this, where, it's obviously we've had the coronavirus, the pandemic, and there's an aspect of, it's important to be safe, right? But you start to see people doing way more extreme things than what the, common recommendations are. When you start to see someone driving in their car wearing 2 masks, right? A mask and then a shield and gloves, and they're driving in their car. Well, that's a good example of like just how it starts building, right? And again, I don't want to make too many comparisons to, coronavirus and the pandemic in 2020. But I just want you to see that when you start to feed fear, right, and you start to do behaviors, eventually those behaviors don't achieve the relief that you want. And then that thought happens again, and then it just starts building on a loop. And so when we started to work together, the first thing is just realizing that these thoughts are normal, right? They're a normal part of the human experience. And once we did that, and then we started learning about ego-dystonic and ego-syntonic thoughts, then what we need to realize is that the problem is not the experience of the thought, right? The problem is the behaviors that you're engaging in that are reinforcing the idea in your mind that this thought is something really serious to take seriously. Because that's what the difference is between people who have OCD and anxiety disorders versus people who have these same exact thoughts and just dismiss them, is that person doesn't engage in behaviors that keep the power of that thought going, right? So once we determined the ego-dystonic, concept, and also really started to started to create distance from our thoughts, right? Realizing that we aren't our thoughts. One of the ways that we achieve that is through meditation. So if this is something you're struggling with, one of the things I always recommend to people is, with a meditation, right? Or start a meditation practice. Now we have, different meditations that you can check out over at Restored Minds as well, specifically for stress and anxiety. So that's a great place to start. But when we start looking at what we did is we started looking at all the behaviors. And again, some of the behaviors are so sneaky, right? That's why it's so important that you work with someone who really understands this, because it was all the behaviors that she was doing from, not touching kitchen knives to not having certain shows on television, right? To, it's these subtle questions that she would ask her husband, right? Like, hey, you think I'm a good mom, right? Or, hey, if you had to rate me, like how these kind of questions, it seems like an innocent question that the person's asking you. But what you need to understand is that when that thought of fear and doubt pops into that person's head and it creates that stress and anxiety, and then they respond to it by saying, hey, let me ask this person this question. And then when you tell them the answer they want to hear, it creates that relief for them. And it happens instantly, right? It's kind of like a drug hit, right? It creates that instant relief, right? And people with OCD and anxiety are very good at, asking these questions in ways that seem, like nothing's happening, right? But it's just enough to give them that relief. And that's why when we understand that the unwanted fear of the unwanted violent thoughts is it's not a thought problem, right? It's not a content of the thought problem, right? So the content of being violent and snapping and doing something crazy, that's not the problem that we're actually dealing with. What we're dealing with is that thought is creating a stress response in your body. And then from there, you're doing behaviors that are reinforcing it. And then the thought pops up again and you have to do more behaviors, and it's just building, right? And it's eventually making your life smaller and smaller and smaller. And then in this case, it was impacting her relationship with her daughter. So what we did is we started systematically getting rid of those behaviors, right? So it was a kind of a multiple prong approach, in this particular case, where we started with meditation, really creating some of that diffusion between the individual and their thoughts and feelings, right? And then with that, we needed enough space to realize, hey, we have a choice of how we're going to respond to this. And, in our Taking Back Control program, we teach the AAA response, to really make sure you're not doing those mental compulsions as well as the physical. And it's so important that you really make sure you're not doing either physical or mental compulsions. And that's a critical component here. And then finally, really committing to living to the long-term values that you want, right? I mean, she wanted a good relationship with her daughter. Well, that meant that you're going to have physical connection with her. You're going to have to hold her, pick her up, change her, spend time with her, all that stuff. And once we realized that that's what we're really working for, we started to implement that as much as possible. And once you can really reframe the entire problem for yourself, that's when the thoughts lose power. That's when the anxiety calms down. And that's when you really start to create separation and freedom from these unwanted thoughts and feelings. So I hope that was helpful in understanding that, that kind of general case. And if this is something you struggle with, again, we have resources over at Restored Minds. In fact, down in the links, right underneath, you'll have some access to different resources, free meditation, as well as different downloads, and our Taking Back Control program that you can check out and get access to, right? And that's one of the great things. This is all digital. So wherever you are in the world, you can have access to it. So, so check those out if you haven't already. And please support our channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing. It's always really helpful for us, as well as commenting and leaving us any reviews or ideas for future episodes. So thank you very much for taking the time to hang out with us today. And I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you found it helpful, chances are someone else will too, and we'd really appreciate your support by liking and subscribing, and also sharing this video on your social platforms. Also, if you're looking for additional help, we have some resources right down in the links below to help you on your journey. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you soon.